Captain Forrest Sher, man of the carrier Wasp, asked Rear Admiral Lee, Noyes the flag officer aboard his carrier and commander of the task unit, for permission to steam northwest at high speed until he reached launching distance. The Wasp's air group was one of the few in the Naval Air Force that had been trained in night operations. Admiral Noyes refused. A few minutes later, Captain Sherman asked permission again and again. It was denied, and still one more time Sherman pleaded. But Admiral Noyes, knowing Fletcher's state of mind, would not even forward the request for his decision at 3:30 a.m. The long-delayed permission for Fletcher to retire came from Admiral Gorley, and Fletcher turned the force around again and fled south away from the enemy. And on the morning of August 9th, Admiral Turner had all the bad news earlier in the conference with General Vandergrift and Admiral Crutchley aboard the flagship Macaulay Turner, had indicated that since Fletcher had deserted them, he must get the transports out of the dangerous Sadle Canal waters before the next day expected air attacks began. But on the morning of the 9th, surveying the carnage and wondering why the Japanese had left the transports untouched, Turner made the bold decision to remain in place at least for the day so they could unload more supplies. General Vandergrift came aboard the flagship again, and they agreed that the transports would have to move out later that day. In the interim, a message came from Admiral Gormley ordering all surface ships out of what the sailors now called Iron Bottom Sound. Admiral Gormley also warned that the Marines would have to be prepared to repel Japanese reinforcements that were on the way when General Vandergrift had that information, knowing that his men were likely to be short of supplies before the transports could return from Numa. He ordered the Marines to go on the defensive. They would restrict their activity to patrols and shoring up defences against attack from the sea. So on the evening of August 11th, as the transports pulled away from the shore, 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal and 6,000 on Tulagi were stranded. They had enough ammunition to last perhaps a week of heavy fighting. They had food for 37 days, and they had no air cover, no supply train, and no naval protection. The men ashore knew that a naval battle had occurred that night, but it was 2 days before they had the rumour that it had been a stunning defeat for the Allies. The fact that they were ordered to hold place the main line of resistance on the beach and keep the reserve forces inland indicated that Vandergrift expected attack from the sea, but that is all the men really knew. Around the perimeter they flushed a few Japanese, some snipers inflicted casualties, but were usually hunted down and shot as of August 10th. The Marines began to sweat out a counter-invasion by the enemy, and the tension grew, but the Japanese were not ready to follow up immediately on their victory. There were no air attacks, no enemy reinforcements appeared, and no warships except submarines moved in the slot, and these contented themselves with shelling small groups of Americans and small boats crossing from Guadalcanal to Tagi on the morning of August 9th. Admiral Mawa was worried enough about probable attack by American carrier planes that he ordered his cruisers into the rough circle of anti-aircraft disposition. The damage reports showed that the Choai had only the chart room damaged. The Ioba had lost a set of torpedo tubes, the Kinugasa had a storeroom flooded. When a shell went through the hull and had suffered steering damage, and the Kako had lost a float plane and its crew. All the ships had shrapnel and machine gun damage, but only 58 men had been killed, and 53 wounded when Admiral Mawa reached Banville. The 4 heavy cruisers Furutaka, Kinugasa, Aoba, and Kako were sent to Taiyang for repairs. The Chokai Tenryu Yubari and the destroyer Unagi went to Rabaul, and the groups parted company on the afternoon of August 9th. An Australian Hudson scout plane found and followed the Furutaka group, but stayed out of gunshot. The pilot's report brought no Allied action on the surface, because the Japanese ships were too close to their own bases. But the next morning the American submarine S-44 discovered the squadron. The 4 cruisers were steaming in the box formation, protected by a single aircraft. The captain of the submarine, Lieutenant Commander John R. Moore, decided to attack closed in, despite the patrol plane, and fired 4 torpedoes. Kako was hit and sank within a few minutes, carrying down many of her crew when Admiral Mawa stepped ashore at Rabaul. He was greeted by a special message from Admiral Yamamoto, congratulating him on his victory, but also reminding him that he must make every effort to support the land forces of the Imperial Army, which are now engaged in a desperate struggle. Mawa may have gotten the hidden message, and privately Yamamoto was furious with his subordinate for failing to carry out his primary mission of destroying the transports of Guadalcanal until Admiral Mawa made his report. Admiral Yamamoto had not known the strength of the enemy in the area, and Mawa exaggerated, but his story was an antidote for a more ridiculous tale. The Japanese military attaché in Moscow had told Tokyo there was nothing to worry about in the American invasion. The Americans had only 2,000 troops on the island, and their plan was to destroy the airfield and then withdraw. Even at this late date, the Japanese army had very little interest in the trouble at Guadalcanal. Lieutenant General Huake, the commander of the 17th Army, was interested only in the Port Moresby invasion. Hyuka said he could not help. He had no orders from Tokyo. And on August 10th, the fleet hastily organized a very small force of 300 Navy riflemen and 100 troops of the 5th Cibo Special Naval Landing Force and sent them to Guadalcanal on August 11th. Admiral Yamamoto detached Vice Admiral Nutek Kondo's 2nd Fleet from the combined fleet in Japan and sent Kondo toward Guadalcanal. At the same time, Yamamoto made preparations to move his flagship and combined fleet headquarters to truck the naval battle that the Americans called the Battle of Savo Island and the Japanese called the First Battle of the Solomons had ended. The Japanese had scored an impressive tactical victory, but had missed their great opportunity to wipe out the supply ships of the invading forces. The American defences were decimated, the American carriers were frightened away, and General Vandergrift was persuaded not to move ahead to capture all of Guadalcanal Island. If he had been given supplies, he could have done in a day or two with his 177,000 men. Against the few hundred Japanese naval troops and the 2,000 labourers who remained on the island, the result of the lost opportunities for both sides was that there would be no lightning-like victory, but a long, desperate slugging contest. The reinforcement of the Japanese garrison at Guadalcanal was a full week incoming, and its composition was an indication of a major Japanese military weakness a week after the American invasion. General Hook Kataki still refused to take it seriously. As a threat to his Port Moresby plan, Admiral Mawa had asked for army help. But all he could get was the Elchi detachment, which had been scheduled to land and occupy Midway after the Midway battle. This detachment had been taken to Guam and retained as a special unit not under 17th Army control. On August 15th, Admiral Yamamoto ordered the creation of a Guadalcanal reinforcement force and chose Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka and his Destroyer Squadron 2 for the task. For the moment the ships were loading supplies at True, and Tanaka was told to pick up 900 officers and men of the Elite detachment who had been brought there and to take them to Guadalcanal from the first Tanaka, was indignant. He could not understand how combined fleet could expect to do anything with fewer than 1,000 riflemen, and no heavy equipment bamboo spear tactics. He called them. Admiral Yamamoto and the Navy in general knew a good deal about the United States and Americans, but the reverse was true of the Imperial Japanese Army, particularly in the South Pacific. In all these years between wars, the Navy had been studying American methods and American psychology, but the army had been deeply immersed in the Asian continent. If you asked a Japanese general a question about the Russians, he was likely to know the answer, but if you asked him about Americans, he was not. The extent of this ignorance was indicated at Rabaul, when Commander Keisuke Matsunaga, who had once been Yamamoto's aide, was asked by a Southern Area Army Staff officer to describe the United States Marines. Just what sort of an organization was this? The staff officer demanded. And when told that the Marines were the soldiers of the Navy, the Army officer scoffed. Americans, they could be expected to quail at an attack and flee a Bansai charge, abandoning equipment and comrades. Thus, the Imperial Japanese Army entered the Guadalcanal conflict, and the Navy's flights over Guadalcanal and Tulagi had indicated the size of the American invasion operation. Navy pilot Saburo Sakai, looking down on the American flotilla of Guadalcanal on August 7th, had said it was almost unbelievable. I saw at least 70 ships pushing toward the beaches, a dozen destroyers cutting white swathes through the water around them, and there were other ships on the horizon too far distant to make out in detail, or to count. This view would certainly dispel any belief that the American invasion effort amounted to the 2,000 troops reported by the Japanese naval attaché in Moscow, But Sakai was a Navy pilot, and his observations did not reach the enemy. The error persisted at Army headquarters, and when General Hukatake decided to send reinforcements. To Guadalcanal, he estimated that about 1,000 men could do the job, given the superior Japanese fighting spirit, quite unaware of the developments in Tokyo, and Rabal, the Marines on Guadalcanal, waited on October 10th. They stayed within their perimeter and cleared Japanese away from the north shore of the island. There was some shooting, but altogether, whether it was a quiet day, so was August 11th, and several times lookouts on the shore reported submarines. Whether it was one submarine or more was not ascertained, but there was no shelling, and the marine sleep was undisturbed. It was the same on August 12th, except for an incident that was to colour the whole Guadalcanal campaign. While the island was quiet, General Vandergrift was eager to learn the disposition of the Japanese troops, and on August 10th he sent Patrol RS through the jungle west of the Lunga River. They were forced back at the Matanikau River by heavy Japanese rifle and machine gun fire. The Japanese headquarters was located here. When a Japanese naval warrant officer surrendered, he told the Americans that the majority of the Japanese on the island were west of the Matanika River. Furthermore, he said he thought they might all surrender. One of the Marines said he had seen a white flag in the area during a patrol, and Colonel Frank B.G., the 1st Division intelligence officer, decided to take a reconnaissance party in the GKA party, went by boat to a point west of the Matanikau, and then began to move inland. Within few minutes of landing, the Americans ran into a Japanese ambush. Colonel Guta was killed, and only 3 Americans escaped. The flag they had seen earlier had been an ordinary Japanese military flag. White background with red rising sun in the centre folded. The red sun was concealed, and it had appeared to be a white flag of surrender. The Japanese had not intended treachery. They had never offered to surrender. But the Marines back at Lunga Point would never believe that from the moment of Colonel GK's death, it was almost impossible to persuade the Marines in the line to accept surrenders on the rare occasions when the Japanese offered them. The Marines expected an attack at any time, and they prepared their defences as best they could without 70% of their supplies. The expedition had brought large guns for coastal defence, but they were still on the ships that had sailed for the safety of Newa. The largest weapons available for the coast were a few 75 mm guns mounted on half-tracked vehicles, 37 mm anti-tank guns, and 1 captured 3-in Japanese gun. The Marines were better prepared against air attack, and the ships had landed a number of 90 mm anti-aircraft batteries on the first day. In fact, the Japanese pilots flying over the landing beaches on August 7th were astounded to see the anti-aircraft guns in place so quickly in Japanese amphibious operations. It took a whole week to get anti-aircraft guns ashore, because more vital supplies came first. They did not know about the helter-skelter loading of the United States transports from the beginning. Supply was on American minds. On August 10th, the ration was reduced to 2 meals a day, and Japanese rice began. And Enin George W. Pull and 120 mechanics to service the planes that were expected at any moment. The Marines then set to work to lengthen the field by 1,000 feet. But there was nothing they could do about the mud. What mud it was! Viscous, clinging stuff, grey-brown that clung to the men's boots and swallowed trucks up to the hoods on August 12th. An amphibious Catalina flying boat had made the first landing, and there were many pointed remarks about the nature of the plane it took to land on Henderson Field, but General Vandergrift insisted that the field was ready for use as long as the weather was dry. The Americans were not the only ones using destroyers for transportation. On the night of August 15th, 1,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army boarded 6 destroyer transports at True and headed for Guadalcanal. The unescorted destroyers came down quietly on the night of August 18th, past Savo Island and Longa Roads, and through Leno Channel to land at Taiyu Point, about 20 miles east of the American position. Colonel Kona Ichiki, the commander of the unit, still believed there were only 2,000 Americans on the island, with the 5th Sasebo Special NAL Landing Force troops, Japanese Marines, who had landed at Tasafaronga and the existing garrison bivouac in the Matanikau River basin. Ichiki expected to work a Piners movement. He would move westward toward Lunga Point, and they would squeeze the Americans between them. The Japanese destroyers were so contemptuous of the American defences that they stopped to bombard Guadalcanal and Tulagi harbour after landing the troops they shelled the airfield with without effect, and they destroyed a landing craft that was running between Tulagi and Lunga Point. They bombarded the Tulagi docks by the time they began to move in leisurely fashion up the slot. It was daybreak, and the Army B-7S from Espiritu Santo had been informed of their presence. The big bombers attacked and scored one hit on the destroyer Hagi Kazi. She and the other ships moved leisurely no more, but dashed back to Rabaul. The Americans first became aware of the Japanese reinforcements on Guadalcanal when Mai Martin Clemens, the Guadalcanal district officer, showed up at Vandergrift's headquarters with 60 members of the Solomon Islands Defence Force. The islanders proved invaluable to the Marines in tracking, and on August 19th led a patrol under Captain Charles Brush to one of Colonel Lay's units. The Japanese were moving west in a column without regard to patrol vigilance, and the Marine ambushed them and killed 31 of the 34 men. Examination of their equipment and belongings showed that they had landed recently. They had maps of the Marine positions. Although they did not seem to have any conception of the Marine strength on the island, the Marines dug in along the bank of the Tanaru River, which ended at the mouth in a dry sand bee. They dug in along the west side of the bar and set tripwires and barbed wire on the other side at a place they called Hello, and put a 37mm gun to cover the bar on the evening of August 20th. The Japanese began moving from the east toward the Tanaro they gathered in the thick jungle and waited as the hours drifted by. The Marines waited on the west bank of the river. Midnight came, and the jungle was still silent, and 1 o'clock came on the morning of August 21st, and still no action, but at 1:30 a.m. the Japanese launched an attack. 200 Japanese came storming up to the tripwire, the soldiers with their bayonets fixed, hurling grenades ahead of them, the officers swinging their long samurai swords. This sort of attack had paralyzed Allied troops in the jungles of Malaya and Burma, but the Marines turned their rifles and machine guns on the wire, and the Japanese began to fall. The 37mm gun began firing canister shot, which spread out like big shotgun pellets. The Japanese went over around and through the wire and began to overrun the Marine positions, but the Marines stood their ground, swivelling in their foxholes to fire and coming out to slug with the Japanese toe-to-toe bayonet to bayonet. By the time daylight arrived, all the Japanese who had fought the Tanaru were dead, and Colonel Ichi's force was totally disorganized. His wild strategy had been based on surprise attack that would demoralize and destroy a small number of American troops. The tenacity and numbers of the Marines had turned the tables. The Marines sent a battalion upstream along the Tanaru, crossed the river, and flanked the Japanese on the east. They squeezed the Japanese into a pocket in a coconut grove on the shore of the island, from the position beyond the Tanaru field. Guns and machine guns kept the Japanese from crossing the river as the Marines pushed westward. The Japanese fought back with a bayonet charge, but they did not get through. The Marines responded with a bayonet charge and disrupted the Japanese defense. Some Japanese soldiers took to the sea, and a few swam eastward along the coast to safety, but most drowned. Some managed to squeeze through the Marine line to the east and escape. But the majority of the 900 Japanese troops died in the palm grove that evening, as the Marines brought up tanks and began knocking down the trees to min at snipers. Colonel Eliki and several of his officers committed suicide, and the organized defense was ended. The Ichiki force of nearly 1,000 men had lasted just 3 days on Guadalcanal. The Marines had taken only 15 prisoners. They remembered the fate of Colonel Gurkha, and they had lost 35 Marines killed and 75 wounded in this bloodletting. The Japanese reinforcement effort had failed completely, and the Americans had established a new confidence in their ability to stand up against troops who had been touted as the fiercest jungle fighters in the world. The successful Japanese attack in the waters of São Island made it very clear that the entire Guadalcanal expedition was in serious danger. For the moment the island was isolated, and General Vanda and his 17,000 Marines might be in danger of annihilation unless help was brought before the enemy could stage a major landing. Had the Japanese been prepared to move 15,000 to 20,000 troops immediately, The outcome for the Americans would have been disastrous so far. By August 20th, General van der Grie had been extremely lucky because the Japanese had. First misread American intentions and then moved too slowly. The Japanese had not really understood that there was no reason to maintain strong points in New Guinea unless the Guadalcanal threat was removed. Admiral Nimitz was under the mistaken impression that at least Vandergrift's troops and the transport force were protected by Fletcher's carriers. With the announcement of the defeat at Savo, Nimitz hurried to dispatch 2 Marine fighter squadrons from Pearl Harbor, but they could not sail until August 15th. He still thought there would be no gap, not knowing that Fletcher was miles away, and one of the major problems at this difficult period was communication, and the shoestring nature of the operation was nowhere more apparent. Admiral Gormley had located his headquarters at Nomia in New Caledonia, not realizing that due to weather conditions at this time of year he could not communicate with Guadalcanal. Much of the day, messages were routed to Oakland and then back up to Vandergrift. Also communication between Numia Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo, where Admiral McCain's land-based air force was located, were equally bad, which accounted in part for the American failure to spot the Japanese cruisers as they had come charging down the slot as soon as word of the disaster at Guadalcanal was known. Admiral Gormley had asked General MacArthur to detail submarines of the Southwest Pacific Command from other areas to Guadalcanal, but MacArthur replied that to do so would leave Rabaul and Cavan uncovered. It was better to sink the Japanese ships as they headed south than to wait until they arrived on the scene. Gormley agreed. And so in the difficult days of mid-August, the only submarine the Marines saw off Guadalcanal was Japanese. So were the aircraft that hovered above the Green Island in the second 10 days of August. The Japanese had been hit hard by the anti-aircraft guns and the fighters from the carriers during the initial landings on Guadalcanal, when Admiral Yamamoto had realized the Americans were on the island in force. He had sent Vice Admiral Nisho Tahara, commander of the 11th Air Fleet, down to Rabaul to take direct charge of operations on August 10th. The admiral discovered that he had only 22 bombers and 17 fighters in operational condition. Those first 2 days of raiding, from distances that were too great for effective operations, had cost the command heavily in planes, and experienced pilots, Pilot Officer Sakai, for example, who was one of Japan's greatest flyers at that point, was so badly hurt in that first day's operation that he was invalided back to Japan for many months. But since the Americans had absolutely no planes in the sky above Guadalcanal, Admiral Sukar's force was significant and useful on August 11th. Half a dozen Zero fighters flew over the island looking for American planes. They found none, but they did get a good look at the work the Marines were doing below to lengthen the airfield, and they interrupted construction with a series of strafing runs. They went back to Rabaul to report on the activity, and the next day 3 twin-engine Betty bombers flew over to take pictures on August 13th. The weather was too foul for flying, and Henderson Field became a soggy morass of mud, a matter of concern to the Marines, who wondered how any planes could ever operate here. And on August 14th, a flight of 3 Bettys photographed the field. They had a good respect for the Marinese 90 mm anti-aircraft guns, and they stayed high out of range. On August 16th, Commander Matsunaga came over with his food drop and leaflets to cheer up the Japanese soldiers on the ground, since there was no opposition, and a few planes were coming in to rub ball every day from TRU. Admiral Tsukahara ordered a bombing raid on August 18th. 8 Bettys came in to bomb, and were so determined that they risked the fire from the 90 mm guns they did bomb, and created huge craters in the field, but the Marines had the satisfaction of damaging 5 of the bombers. The true import of the debarque at Savo was slower in moving up the United States chain of command than the news of the landings was among the Japanese. Admiral Turner did not arrive at Neuer with the transports until August 14th, when he gave Gourley his report, which was sent on to Nimitz. So when Gormley turned about after his rejection by MacArthur to ask Nitz for submarines, Pearl Harbor was not fully aware of the need for desperate measures, and Nimitz refused on August 12th. Admiral McCain reported that one of his pilots had managed to land a PBY amphibian on the Henderson Field runway, which had been lengthened to 3,600 feet. He suggested that planes could be moved in, but Gurley had no planes from MacArthur. He might have borrowed a few B-7S, but the runway was too short for them, or some P-40 fighters, but their maximum operational altitude was 15,000 feet, and the Japanese had been bombing from 177,000 feet. The escort carrier Long Island was en route to Guadalcanal, carrying marine pilots and planes. But the captain of the Long Island informed Admiral Gawley that many of the marine pilots were so badly trained that it would be murder to send them into combat. No one could blame them. Their unit, Marine Air Group 23, had been organized on May W at EA Field west of Pearl Harbor, and the 2 squadrons of fighter pilots had been given Brewster Buffalo's slow, old-fashioned aircraft that had not been able to stand up to anything the Japanese had put in the air. In the past 6 months, the 2 bomber squadrons were slightly better off flying SBD-2S, but these were already obsolete by 2 generations. This unit had been selected for the Guadalcanal air mission in July. The Buffaloes had been replaced by Grumman F-4FS, but there had been little time for training. Many of the pilots brought in to fill up the squadrons were fresh from flying school, and the hottest aircraft they had flown were advanced trainers. This was scarcely adequate training for pilots who were going to meet some of the most experienced flyers in the Japanese Navy. There were, however, a few survivors of marine fighter attack, Squadron 221, the squadron assigned to Midway, which was virtually wiped out before the car carrier battle. A dozen of them were sent ashore at Ep.2, and their planes were taken by experienced pilots from marine fighter attack to stay outside the danger zone, thereby tying up the carriers, cruisers and destroyers that could be useful in defending Guadalcanal. Gawley had word that the Japanese were bringing motor torpedo boats into the waters of the island, and directed Fletcher to be ready to move the task force in at night to destroy the Japanese surface ships that had occasionally bombarded the American positions. Fletcher balked, so the confusion continued, and until August 20th, Vandergrift received no help at all on that day. The Long Island catapulted 19 F-4F fighters and 12 Douglas SBD dive bombers from a point southeast of the San Cristobal Islands. The little carrier then steamed away from the combat zone because her planes would not return. They landed at Henderson Field to become the nucleus of the Cactus Air Force, the small group of fighters and bombers that would try to protect the Marines from air and sea attack that same day. Admiral Nimitz sent as strong a message as he could. He instructed Gormley that carrier planes must be used to defend Guadalcanal from enemy landings. The message fell on ears that were generally unreceptive, having opposed the Guadalcanal landings from the beginning. Admiral Gawley looked gloomily at the future and suggested that there was doubt whether or not they could hold the area. No one had more doubts than General Vandergrift at that point, his troops virtually alone on a tiny island surrounded by his country's enemies. But no one heard that sort of complaint from him. The pilots of the Marine Air Group 23 landed at Henderson Field. The first plane to land was that of Major R.C. Mangram, commander of scout bombing, Squadron 232. No one had ever been greeted more joyfully as the planes came in over the island. The Marines in their defensive positions looked up, and for the first time in 10 days saw above them American planes rather Japanese. They began to cheer when Major Mangram stepped down from the wing of his bomber. He was met by General Vandergrift with a hearty handshake, and as the other pilots came down one by one, they too were cheered and treated as conquering heroes, instead of as the untested flyers they were. They had come just in time. The next day, the Japanese resumed serious air operations on August 21st. The newly arrived American planes were in the air flying support missions for the ground troops who were mopping up Colonel Ichi's shattered force and flying air patrol over the island. Captain John L. Smith, the commander of Fighting 223, was flying a patrol mission with 3 other pilots when they encountered 60 fighters. Smith saw them first about 500 feet above the Marinese, 14,000 feet level, and just as he identified them from his memory of silhouettes in training days, the Zeros turned into them and began an attack. From that point on, the 10 planes turned and dodged and fired, each seeking advantage. The Zeros, as Smith had known, were faster and more maneuverable than his own craft, and the Zero pilots got in many bursts against the 4 F-4Fs. But unlike the Allied fighters that usually faced the Japanese, The strong construction of the Grummons kept them flying when badly shot up, and the armour behind the seatback saved the pilots that day. Captain Smith shot down his first Zero without knowing it until later, and he had been firing at 1-0 when suddenly he found 2 more Zeros on his tail and took sharp evasive action. The first Zero zoomed away, and Smith found it difficult to disengage from the other after he looked around and found that one of his pilots was missing. He turned back north towards Savo Island and found that pilot Sergeant John Lindley beset by several Zeros. The 4 American fighters attacked again. The Zeros shot them up, but soon the Zero pilots realized they were running low on fuel for their long flight back to Rabu, and they disengaged. The Americans limped home, and Captain Smith discovered when he tried to land that his hydraulic system had been shot out and the wheels would not come down. The oil system failed and the engine quit. He glided in. On a dead stick landing and the F-4F ground across the gravel of the Henderson Field runway to a crunching stop, Captain Smith walked away from the landing, but his plane was a total loss. The Japanese resumed serious air operations against Guadalcanal on August 21st, sending over surface bombers escorted by Zero fighters. The F-4F fighters had their disadvantage in mixing with the Zeros, which were faster, but the F-4Fs had the major advantage of armour to protect the pilot. On the second day, Captain John Smith, leader of the group fighter squadron, shot down a Zero, but many of the F-4Fs were also shot down. These eager but green pilots were facing some of the cream of the Japanese Naval Air Force flyers, who had flown hundreds of combat hours 2 days after the arrival of the Marine flyers General Millard Harron. The South Pacific Air Commander arranged to bring in a part of the Army Air Corps 67th Fighter Squadron. These pilots were equipped with P-400 fighters, an advanced version of the P-39, but that was incapable of attaining 20,000 feet, the height at which the Japanese liked to come in and drop down out of the sun. They could be used as flying artillery, for each carried a 37 mm cannon in its nose, plus 6 machine guns. Part of their problem was the heavy armament that bogged them down from the beginning. The airmen were beset with the most vexing difficulties. Enan Polk and his Navy mechanics had been able to bring up the gasoline drums brought in by the destroyer transports to supply the planes with aviation gas, but every gallon had to be pumped out of a drum by hand and decanted into the airplane fuel tanks. The bombers had to be loaded by manpower, for there were not even any hand hoists on the island, and the machine gun ammunition belts had to be manhandled and carried by truck or jeep. Captain Dale Brand's 67th Army Air Force Fighter Squadron was supposed to arrive in force, but the condition of the field was so bad after a few landings and a few hours that 2/3 of the squadron was delayed at Espiritu Santo for several days. Captain Smith's Marine F-4FS found themselves in difficulty almost immediately because the planes had exhausted their oxygen bottles, and none had been brought in during the first slender supply effort. The F-4F pilots had to get up high to fight the Zeros, and they could not go up to 20,000 without oxygen on August 22nd. General Vandergrift informed Admiral McCain that had been forced to suspend fighter patrols until more oxygen arrived. Admiral Fletcher was still operating far from Guadalcanal, which he justified by claiming that it was essential to conceal the presence of the carriers until necessary. But on August 20th, a Japado's Kawanishi flying boat on long patrol spotted the carrier force and reported its presence 500 miles west of Banville. Admiral Yamamoto had that information, and the news that Colonel Itchiki's force had been wiped out Japanese headquarters on Guadalcanal also made it very BL for the first time that the American force was not to be numbered in the hundreds, but in the many thousands. These reports caused Admiral Yamamoto to reconsider his plans. Admiral Kondo's force was scheduled to stop over at Truk for fuel and supplies, and to make a more or less leisurely attack on Guadalcanal. The presence of the carriers, and the new knowledge that the American invasion was a major operation, caused an immediate change. From that point on, Japanese planes shadowed the United States carrier force. Admiral Yamamoto ordered the combined fleet to fuel at sea. There was no time for leisure refueling. At sea was just as difficult for the Japanese as it was for the Americans. The ships had to slow to 6 knots and became prime targets for submarine or air attack. But it was done early on the morning of August 23rd. Admiral Kondo's ships were 400 m north of Guadalcanal. Ahead of them were two transports carrying 1,500 Japanese troop reinforcements, escorted by a cruiser and 6 destroyers in the hiatus of August 10 to 20. It became obvious to the American air search planes that the Japanese at Rabaul were building for attack. Admiral Nimitz dispatched the carrier Hornet to the South Pacific on August 17 to join the Enterprise Saratoga, and WASP Admiral Gormley had concurred in Admiral Fletcher's decision to hold the carriers out of action until the Japanese launched their major naval attack expected at any moment for that reason. During those long 10 days, the Japanese had complete control of the seas around Guadalcanal, and their destroyers ranged in and out on August 21. The supply transports Fomalhaut and Alhena were on their way to Guadalcanal to deliver some desperately needed supplies. The Marines were on short rations, and those made available largely through captured Japanese supplies. The airfield had to have gasoline, and as yet, in spite of McCain's pleas, no transport planes had been provided, so the surface convoy was the only answer, dangerous as it was. That night the destroyer Blue, one of the transport escorts, was torpedoed by the Japanese destroyer Kawakaze, and damaged so badly that later she had to be scuttled once more. The Japanese had shown their superiority in night fighting, and the Japanese also showed their greater aggressiveness in air operations. Admiral Yamamoto had not hesitated to order his ship force descending on the Solomons to fuel at Sea Admiral Fletcher, however worried about fueling in the face of the enemy. And on August 23 the fuel problem was much on his mind. Since his carriers were less than half filled with oil on that morning, one of Admiral McCain's PB from the tender Mac in the Santa Cruz Islands spooked the transports and warship escort that was 50 miles out ahead of the Japanese fleet. The pilot had made a minor error. He identified the escort as 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers. Actually, it was 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers. But the import was clear. The Japanese were moving to reinforce the garrison on Guadalcanal with 2 shiploads of troops, with the Japanese naval superiority in the area. It might be expected that this small force would not be the last reinforcement at Fletcher had the word that morning, and the Saratoga Air Group was ordered to attack the Japanese by 2:45 a.m. That afternoon the planes were in the air. 32 bombers and 6 fighters. Fletcher had other indications of Japanese activity at 7:30 a.m. That morning the search planes of the carrier Enterprise had encountered a Japanese submarine traveling fast on the surface, heading south. They attacked unsuccessfully. An hour later, another plane sighted a second submarine also speeding south. On the surface it attacked also unsuccessfully. It was known throughout the fleet that the Japanese always sent a scouting line of submarines ahead of a war fleet, so this should have been warning to Fletcher by mid-AM morning that he faced much more than transports and their escort vessels. But Fletcher did not regard the presence of the submarines as positive indication of the presence of a fleet. The report from that P by about the reinforcements reached General Vandergrift at about the same time that Fletcher received it. Vandergrift was vitally concerned lest the Japanese bring in strong reinforcements when he had so little food and ammunition on Guadalcanal. He was also worried about the obvious weakness of his Tui Cactus Air Force, with its handful of F-4F fighters, one of them already reduced to scavenger parts, his P-400S, which were really only equipped for troop support, and the handful of bombers. The absence of the oxygen bottles meant that pilot who tried to attain altitude above 10,000 feet was potentially in trouble. But by this time Vandergrift had no confidence in Fletcher, so he decided that even if it was suicidal for the pilots, he would have to launch an attack on the Japanese transport force. The Japanese reinforcement unit actually consisted of 1 big transport, the Kinri Umaru, and 4 destroyers converted for fast transport work. The escort was commanded by Rear Admiral Rizo Tanaka, and in his cruiser he led Destroyer Squadron 2 in escort. Tanaka's lookout saw the PBI that reported them. Ready to fly, they were held at the field until General Vane Grift received a dong-delayed report that Admiral Tanaka's force had turned back. Then he released the planes, and they flew back to the Saratoga. They left behind 2 dive bombers that had engine trouble, and 27 1,000-pound bombs for the Cactus Air Force that morning of August 24. Admiral Fletcher was badly doped by his unfortunate decision to release one carrier on the eve of battle with the Saratoga's air group on Guadalcanal. All he had to send out for search combat air patrol and any missions were the 87 planes of the Enterprise. The dawn search used 23 bombers, and they discovered nothing but another surfaced submarine, whose presence still did not seem to mean anything to Admiral Fletcher. But even if the Japanese had been found that morning, Admiral Fletcher had only 28 bombers with which to attack until the Saratoga planes could land on their carrier and be refueled and rearmed at 4 o'clock in the morning. The Ryuyo and her escort were detached from the main force for their mission. United States Navy historian Samuel Eliot Morrison said that Ryuyo was sent out as bait for the American carriers. Captain Tamichi Hara, commander of that force's destroyer, Amatsukaze, indicated that the decision was a hasty one. But historian Paul S. Dull, a student of the Japanese Navy, found no indication that the decision was a hasty one, or that Yamam expected to sacrifice the Ryujo. But some of the Japanese officers in this detachment were more than a little worried. Ryuo's pilots were mostly replacements. The Japanese and American search planes were out early on the morning of August 24th, and the Americans made the first sighting at 9:35 a.m. A PBY reported a Carrier 2 cruisers and a destroyer about 150 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The report again was inaccurate in describing the ships, but that was unimportant. The plane had spotted a carrier and placed it correctly. Admiral Fletcher had been annoyed with the failures of McCain's air search planes in the past, and he was still angry about the poor reporting by the PBY on the 23rd, which had caused him to launch a mission that never made contact. So he ignored the PBY report, but this particular PBY continued to shadow the Ryujo and her escort, and reported again to the Mackinac on the sighting Admiral Fletcher had the second report, but still refused to believe. Then at noon another PBY reported on the Ruo detachment, and finally Fletcher reluctantly ordered a search. Meanwhile, the usual morning search launched by the Saratoga had turned back at the end of 200 mil, since that was the optimum range for carrier bombers. Here again was an illustration of the inferiority of the American search pattern. The searchers missed the Nagumo carriers by about 100 mil. The Saratoga air group began to arrive around the carrier at 11:30 a.m. and 20 m out. 4 fighter pilots spotted a Japanese Kawanishi 4-engine flying boat and shot it down, but the American force had been discovered just after noon as the Saratoga planes were refueling. The remaining bombers were launched for the search to the northwest. Each of the 23 planes was assigned a narrow, pie-shaped section of ocean extending out 250 miles from the carrier aboard the Ryujo. The lookouts spotted the PBY that discovered them and watched helplessly as the big plane trailed along. Admiral Tadich Chihara could have sent up fighters to shoot down the PBY, but it would not have solved the problem. It was certain from the first few minutes that a report had been sent out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Just as the planes from the Enterprise were taking to the air, the Ryujo launched 115 fighters and 6 Betty bombers to attack Henderson Field. As the Americans moved towards the carrier ship's radar, spotted the planes as radar blips, and at last Admiral Fletcher was convinced he ordered Saratoga's air group to attack. And although the pilots were re-dyed from lack of sleep and had already flown 5 hours that morning, they manned their planes. The Marines on Guadalcanal were alerted by AE Coast Watcher that enemy planes were coming in from M. And at 2:20 a.m. the 14 F-4Fs of the Cactus Air Force were in the air, although they did not have oxygen bottles. Luckily they didn't need them that day, for the Japanese bombers came in at 9,000 feet, and from above the F-4Fs dived down and caught them one after another. The torpedo planes fell into the sea as the F-4Fs and the Zeros cartwheeled in the sky. Captain Moran Carl shot down 2 torpedo planes and 1 Zero that day, but 3 of the F-4F pilots fell beneath the guns of the Zeros. A few of the bombers got through bombed Henderson Field and then formed up again under the protection of the Zeros and headed back to the Ryujo. For some reason, Admiral Chuichi Hara had not ordered up a combat air patrol that day at about 2:30 a.m. The Guadalcanal raiders reported back that they had bombed Henderson Field and were returning. Then there was nothing, for just after sending the MS Sage, the flight leader's plane was shot down, and since he had the only long-range radio, the remaining planes lost communication with their carrier at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Lookouts with the Japanese task unit discovered several B-7S above them. The guns of the escort ships opened fire, although the range was extreme, and the B-7S droned on high above, until finally the Ryujo sent up 2 fighters. Then the B-7S moved off, and when they had gone, the Zeros remained in the air, as combat air patrols. Still, the car did not launch any more planes until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Just as the captain of the carrier was turning her into the wind to launch planes, the bombers from the Saratoga arrived. They were a combination of dive bombers and torpedo planes, and Commander Harry DeFelt led them in. Then the dive bombers peeled off first and headed down to the sea from 14,000 feet. As the Japanese ships saw the American planes, the escorts moved out into a 5,000-yard circle around the Ryuho in order to make better use of their anti-aircraft guns to protect her. The bombers screamed down through a sky dotted with smoke puffs, released their bombs and straightened out to fly over the carrier and strafe the ships. The fighters came down, strafing too, and struck at the Zeros. Then the torpedo bombers came in using a technique the Japanese had employed so successfully in the Battle of the Coral Sea. A pair of torpedo planes attacked simultaneously, one from each bow, so that no matter which way the carrier turned, it was likely to run into one of the torpedoes. The bombers scored several hits on the Ryuho near the stern, and the 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs went through the flight deck. Then more bombs came in, and great clouds of smoke rose, punctuated by columns of fire from his perch on the bridge of the Amatsuki captain. Hara could see the smoke and sense that the carrier's fuel tanks had caught fire. He did not see any torpedo hits, but the Americans claimed some, whether torpedoes struck or not. The Ryuyo was in her death throes 10 minutes after the bombers arrived. The fires were uncontrollable, and they got to the aviation gasoline supply, and the magazines she began to list to starboard, and her red coat of anti-fouling paint was exposed. The flight deck dipped down until it nearly touched the waves. A few of the American planes had saved bombs and torpedoes for the tone, and the destroyers and other planes came over low to strafe, but neither these Japanese ships nor the American aircraft were damaged in this attack. Commander Felt gave the signal, and the American planes turned back toward their carrier as dusk came. The Japanese destroyers rallied to begin rescue operations. The captain of the Ryujo had sent messages warning the returning planes from the Guadalcanal strike to head Fuka since he could not land them, but the planes came in anyway, circled their carrier, and then ditched alongside the pilot, were rescued by the destroyers, and at about 6:30 a.m. that night, a pair of B-7S appeared in the gloom and bombed the sinking carrier and the rescuers. But all the bombs missed by a wide margin. The Ryuho was dead. In the water, and the destroyers moved alongside. Even though the carrier had a 40 degrees list and could not last more than a few minutes longer, the Amatsuki came up so close that the superstructure of the carrier brushed the destroyer's bridge, and sailors with long poles had to stand by to hold the little ship off. The carrier planks were set between the decks, and more than 300 men poured across. Captain Tad Kao was the last man off his ship, and after he stepped across the destroyer, engines speeded, and she gunned away from the side of the carrier. The Tone and the Tokitsu Kazi were both picking up crewmen who had gone overboard. More Ryujo planes arrived and circled overhead in the growing darkness. 14 planes then ditched in the sea, and the ships picked up the air crews. The ships turned away as Ryujo sank, and it was not 3 minutes since Captain Kato had stepped across the planks. He turned to Commander Hara of the Amatsukaze, his voice quavering, "Commander Hara, I don't know how to thank you." And it was then that Commander Hara learned that his dear friend, Hisaki Kishi, executive officer of the Ryuho, was one of those who did not make it. The war seemed suddenly very real and very deadly during the afternoon. As Admiral Fletcher worried aboard the Saratoga, the combat air patrol shot down 3 Japanese snoopers. The last of these was destroyed just after 2 o'clock, and although Fletcher did not know it, the plane was from the cruiser Chuma of the combined fleet, and its crew managed to send off a position report on the American carriers just before the plane crashed into the sea. Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the Third Fleet and of the carrier striking force, was still smarting from Admiral Yamamoto's obvious dissatisfaction with the conduct of the Midway operation. Privately, Yamamoto held Nagumo responsible for the defeat because of his failure to find the Americans in time. And Nagumo was well aware of the attitude of his superior when he learned that the Americans had 2 carriers south of Guadalcanal and that they had just flown a strike. His lined square face broke into a smile. Here was the chance to avenge the misfortune of Midway. In less than an hour, the first attack wave rolled along the decks of Zuikaku and Shakaku 27 bombers and 10 Zero fighters from the 2 carriers. 10 minutes after that first wave left the decks, 2 of the Enterprise search planes discovered the Shakaku and attacked her with the 500B bombs. They carried on search missions. The search planes claimed a hit and a near. Miss Lieutenant Roy Davis dropped his bomb just off the starboard side, and Ensign Robert S.E. Shaw's hit off the starboard quarter. A Zero of the Combat Air Patrol came after the SBDs, but in one of those accidents of war, the Zero fighter was shot down by anti-aircraft fire from his own ships. Before he could attack, the carriers were unscathed, and within half an hour were launching their second strike against the American earners. Admiral Fletcher learned of the whereabouts of the 2 big Japanese carriers early in the afternoon, but he was very short of planes, having the Wasp off to refuel, and having launched the Enterprise search and the Saratoga attack on the Rougeau, so he did not send an attack against the Japanese carriers. Instead, he concentrated on the defense of his own, and extra combat air patrol fighters were put in the air, and more fighters sat on deck, armed and full of fuel, ready to take off in a hurry. The 2 carriers separated. Each moved into the center of a circle on whose perimeter, about 2 miles away, were ranged the cruisers, destroyers, and battleships to help screen the carrier from air attack with their anti-aircraft barges at 4:25 a.m. The first Japanese attack wave found a group of American planes winging home from search missions and followed them back to the American carriers. Then, just before 4:30 a.m. in the afternoon, the Japanese flight commander saw the American carriers and split his planes into several small groups, better to avoid the anti-aircraft fire the American who had seen them on Radar 20. Minutes earlier had their maximum fighter strength in the air. 53 planes headed out from the carriers to attack the Japanese bombers. Before they could strike at the same time, the Enterprise sent off her last 11 bombers and 7 torpedo bombers to strike the enemy ships. Saratoga sent off 5 torpedo bombers and 2 dive bombers, even though the pilots had just gotten into the planes to taxi them out of the way for landing of the combat air patrol. The pilots had not been briefed, nor did they have any navigation equipment aboard, but they were told to join up with the Enterprise group and find the enemy. The order had to come from the Admiral. No one else would have given it. It was further proof that carrier operations ought to be run by aviators and not by battleship men who wear observer wings. The fighters from the 2 American carriers scattered to offer the most protection. Some of them circled the carriers at various altitudes, between 10,000 and 15,000 feet 9, were 40 miles north of the ship. At 15,000 feet, the remainder were sent out to meet the Japanese as they came in. An Enterprise fighter made the first contact 33. Out. The pilot reported 36 bombers at 12,000 feet, with many other planes above and below, but aboard the Enterprise lieutenant. Commander D.A., the fighter director, was overwhelmed by the senseless chatter of the fighter circuit between pilots. "I'm in high blower, where are you? Bill, let go, get them." It was good theatre, but bad radio discipline, and D.A. was unable to make much sense of what the pilots were seeing, or to give information from one group to the other. All he could do was remind the fighters that they were to concentrate on the enemy bombers and torpedo planes, and leave the fighters alone. Because of this poor radio discipline, several of the Japanese units managed to sneak through the American fighter net and approach the carriers, so the Japanese bombers came bearing in the F-4Fs trying to get at them, and the Zero fighters rising to meet the Americans. The weather was superb, ceiling and visibility unlimited, and the wind was about 14 knots aboard the Enterprise. The radar units lost track of the enemy bombers as they came within minimum range, but just after 5 o'clock, the crew of 120 mm anti-aircraft guns spotted the first Japanese plane at 12,000 feet. Already in its dive, the gun began firing, although there was no chance of hitting the target at this range, but the 20 mm fire attracted the bigger guns of the ships around the carrier, and they began to fire. The Japanese chose their targets. Most of them selected the Enterprise, but a number went after the battleship North Carolina, which was 2,500 yards off the starboard bow of the carrier. The dive bombers came down one after the other with no hesitation, dropping to 2,000 feet or less, BMing and pulling out low over the target. The volume of anti-aircraft fire from the American ships was tremendous. The 5-in guns were so effective that several bombers broke off their dives, and several others were set afire. The 20 mm guns and the 1.1-in guns were most effective on planes that had made their drops and were zooming over or alongside the carrier. In this, the American destroyers were extremely successful. The crew of the Grayson, 1,800 yards to port of the Enterprise, saw the first bomber pulling out and coming up along the Grayson's starboard quarter at 300 feet above the sea, strafing. The destroyer, it passed. The strafing injured several members of the crew of No. 3 gun and of the nearby 20 mm anti-aircraft gun, but as the plane moved over the ship, the after 20 mm guns trained on it and poured in a concentration of fire. The plane staggered and crashed off the port beam. The fire from the North Carolina was also devastating, but in spite of it, and heavy fire from every one of the other 7 ships in the screen, the Japanese did not hesitate. 10 of the bombers were seen to splash around the carrier, but a dozen carried out their attack with various degrees of success. The attack had been in progress for 3 minutes, and the carrier had managed to avoid damage, when a near hit in the water under the ship's fantail blew the after end of the flight deck up a foot, buckling the plates and shattering the wooden deck 120. MM gunner was thrown into the air and 15 feet across the flight deck to land in another gun position on the port quarter. Miraculously, he was scarcely hurt, but the same could not be said. After the next strike, a large bomb struck the forward edge of the No. 3 elevator and penetrated to the third deck below before blowing up. The explosion was devastating. On the second and third decks, fires began to blaze. Decks bulged out and holes appeared in the plating of the ship so that men could look out at the sea. When the smoke cleared, it appeared that 35 men had been killed in this explosion. The bomb also knocked out the power for the 5-in guns AF, which meant they had to be fired by hand, and this cut their efficiency in half. The ship began to list about 3 degrees. Almost immediately the Enterprise was hit by another bomb, about 20 feet from the first one. The blast set off, powder killed 38 men at the 25-in guns at No. 3 gun gallery, and knocked out both guns. Then came the third bomb, which hit just after of the island. Luckily it blew up as it penetrated the flight deck, and so the damage was not serious below, although No. 2 elevator was put out of use. Several other near misses started fires, ruptured plating, and damaged gasoline piping and water systems. In his efforts to escape the Japanese attackers, Captain Arthur C. Davis increased the speed of the Enterprise to 30 knots, and thus outran his screen. The North Carolina, with her immense firepower, could not keep up, and dropped about 2 mil behind, rendering her anti-aircraft support negligible. Captain George H. Fort of the North Carolina estimated that 16 dive bombers, 12 level bombers, and 8 torpedo planes attacked his ship. Only 3 of them got through the anti-aircraft barrage, and they dropped bombs that nearly hit the ship, but not quite. North Carolina was shaking, some gunners were knocked down, and water spewed over the ship, but there was no real damage nor any casualties before those bombers had attacked the Enterprise task group. They had run the gauntlet of American fighters sent out ahead to intercept them. The F-4FS followed the instructions of their fighter director and went after the bombers, 2 99 dive bombers and Nakajima 97 torpedo bombers. But each time they attacked a bomber, they found a 0 or 2 attacking them, and in turning to avoid the guns of the Zeros, they had to let the bombers through. The screen machinist Runan, who had scored so well in the early hours of the invasion, was again in the forefront of the defenders. He was flying at 18,000 feet 5M north of the carrier, when he saw a dive bomber that had escaped through the first screen of fighters. He came down out of the sun and began firing. The bomber exploded before him. He turned back up into the sun, waited a moment, and when another dive bomber came through, he set it afire too. He was attacked by a Zero whose pilot overshot on his first round. Let Ran get onto his tail. Ran began firing his 50 caliber machine guns and the Zero blew up. Then he shot down a fourth bomber and damaged a fifth, so that it turned back toward its carrier. The Japanese attack on the Enterprise was over in 4 minutes as the enemy turned back towards the Zuikaku and the Shakaku. They passed the returning squadron of 10 dive bombers coming back from the strike on the Ryuhyo just after 5 o'clock. Lieutenant Commander J. Kearns spotted 4 dive bombers a few feet above the water heading home. The American bombers dived underneath the Japanese planes, fired a few bursts from the pilots' guns, and then let the free gunners in the back have a chance. The technique was effective. 3 of the Japanese bombers were shot down, and the 4th escaped, smoking. The Americans believed they had shot down nearly all the Japanese planes that had attacked, but it wasn't so. The second Japanese attack never found the American carriers because of an error in the leader navigation. But 4 of these bombers were shot down by American fighters. Of the first attack's 10 fighters and 27 bombers, 6 fighters and 18 bombers were lost. Although the Enterprise group claimed to have been attacked by 70 planes and to have shot down more than 40 of them, the planes that had been ordered off the deck of the Enterprise when the enemy appeared now went looking for the Japanese carriers, but they did not find them. They prepared to attack what appeared to be a group of speeding ships, only to discover that it was a reef. At least they had not wasted their bombs. The torpedo planes managed to make it back to the carrier that night, but the dive bombers KNRI ran out of gas and finally landed safely on Henderson Field. The Saratoga's group of 2 dive bombers and 5 torpedo bomb sent out to find the enemy without any specific informer Dune was luckier. Lieutenant Harold H. Larson spotted Admiral Kondo's main group of surface ships north of the Stewart Islands. The 5 torpedo bombers attacked first, but the ships managed to evade their fish. The 2 dive bombers attacked a ship, the seaplane Tender Cheetos, and neatly bracketed it with near misses that destroyed several of her seaplanes and put her port engine out of action. She had to limp back to Tro and then was sent to Japan for repairs as darkness closed in. The Americans counted their air losses. They had lost 20 planes, but not that many pilots. The crews of 7 planes were rescued. That was the end of the action on August 24th. That night, Admiral Kondo went searching to the south, hoping for a night surface engagement. But when he had found nothing by 11:30 a.m., he turned about and headed north again. Not all the pilots and crew of the opposing air forces made it back to their carriers. One Saratoga bomber ditched off the beach of San Cristobal Island, and the crew swam to shore to await rescue. Another, coming home late and low on gas, ditched near a small island, and the crew took to the life raft. A number of the Ryuo's planes landed or crash-landed on Japanese-held islands to the north. The destroyer Amatuk Kazi rescued 2 Japanese air crewmen who were floating in a raft about 50 m from the American task force. During the afternoon, the damage control parties aboard the Enterprise put out the fires and began to put the flight deck as much to rights as they could within an hour after the bombing. The ship was steaming again at 24 knots, and landing aircraft 74 men had been killed and another 95 wounded, but otherwise the ship was functioning almost normally. Then, at 7 o'clock that night, the ship's rudder suddenly jammed as she was turning hard right, and she very nearly ran down the destroyer. BCH water used in the firefighting had seeped into the steering engine room and shorted out the controls. The ship had to slow to 10 knots as the repairs were made, but in less than 40 minutes the steering was right that afternoon too. Fletcher learned of the sighting of Admiral Nagumo's force, but it was too late, and he had too few planes to launch a new attack. The fueling of the Wasp probably cost the Americans the chance of a major victory on the night of the 24th. Fletcher retired to the south, still worrying about fuel, and on the 25th he began fueling. The Enterprise was sent back to Pearl Harbor for repair with the cruiser Portland, and 4 destroyers as escort. The North Carolina, the cruiser Atlantia, and the destroyers Grayson and Monson joined the Saratoga group, which soon met up with the Wasp. Fletcher still had 2 carriers and a strong surface force on the next morning, August 25th. The 2 carrier forces had retired almost as though both had forgotten the reason for the mission. The need of the Japanese to protect the convoy bringing 1,500 reinforcing troops to Guadalcanal, and the need for the Americans to destroy the convoy, the task was left to the 12 dive bombers and 18 pilots of Marine Air Group 223 and 10 pilots of Scouting 5, the force from the Enterprise that had landed on Guadalcanal on the night of August 24th and was directed to remain when the carrier was sent back to Pearl Harbor just after midnight on August 25th. The Japanese sent 4 destroyers down the slot to bombard Henderson Field they shelled for 2 hours at 2:30 a.m. in the morning. Major Mangram and 2 other pilots took off to bomb the enemy ships, but they missed them an hour and a half later. 3 more pilots took off, and again their bombs fell astray. 1 SBD was lost when its pilot became confused about, direction ran low on gas, and ditched in those pre-dawn hours. A PBY located the Tanaka reinforcement convoy and reported on it, and at 6 o'clock Henderson Field put up 8 SBDs to attack Admiral Tanaka's group, arrived led by the cruiser Jinsu the Kagero Isoki Kazi, and Yayo had headed back toward the Shortlands after keeping the Marines awake that night. The 4 destroyers turned around to join Tanaka's force, and they all began the run for Guadalcanal. Just then, at 8:30 a.m., the American dive bombers began to peel off above them. 5 of the planes attacked the cruiser Jinsu, and Lieutenant Lawrence put a bomb into the ship between her A and B turrets. The bomb knocked out the ship's radio communications, which meant the Admiral could no longer direct the battle by radio. It took him some time to direct the battle at all, because he had been knocked senseless by the concussion. The bomb had gone below the deck and started fire so near the magazines that the officers feared they would blow up. The captain flooded them, and the fires were soon brought under control. But Jinu's fighting ability was sorely hurt. She had sent the Wasp off to fuel on the eve of battle. He was short and to the point. "There is plenty of fuel in the vicinity of his force," he said, but by August 25th it did not matter. An opportunity had been missed, and the result was going to be a long battle of attrition, and Guadalcanal was quiet after the noon air raid of August 25th. The Japanese effort to reinforce the garrison having failed the troops had been taken back to Shortland Island to regroup and try again. The slot was still quiet that night, so General Van Derry could take time to assess his situation until the Amir Doans could achieve at least parity in the air. It was unlikely that supplies could be brought in on a regular basis, so the primary need was to strengthen the Cactus Air Force, which had suffered enormously in the battles of the last 5 days. Of the 19 F-4FS flown in from the Long Island 5 had been destroyed, and 3 were inoperable, and waiting for parts of the 12 dive bombers, only 9 were operational. Vandergrift did have the addition of the 10 Enterprise bombers, but the net gain was minor on August 23rd, about 10 minutes after the F-4Fs had taken off to intercept the Ryujo bombers. Admiral Khan's personal PBI had shown up at the field crammed with all the oxygen bottles that could be found on short notice at Espiritu Santo, but that was no way to support an air force. What was needed was real supply, and that meant the dispatch to Guadalcanal of the transport William Ward Burroughs, which was carrying the ground crews and supplies for the Marine Air Group 23. Admiral Yamamoto decided that pending a major naval action, he would continue the resupply of the Japanese gas by destroyer, and from the air he would keep the pressure on Henderson Field to prevent a build-up. On August 26th, the Rabu Air Force sent 16 Bettys over to bomb, and they arrived over the island at 11:24 a.m., announced as usual by the coast watchers, and every available United States aircraft was in the air to meet them. Most of the pilots were too green to be effective, but Captain Smith, Captain Rivers Morel, and 2 other pilots shot down 3 bombers and damaged a number of others. Captain Marion Carl shot down 2 Zeros, 1 F-4F was shot down, and its pilot Lieutenant Arak Corey was killed. Despite the harassment, the Japanese dropped their bombs, damaging several planes, and setting fire to a dump of precious aviation gasoline. By the end of the day, the Cactus Air Force was down to 11 F-4Fs and 9 SBDs, plus the Enterprise contingent. Meanwhile, on August 26th, Admiral Yamamoto arrived at Truk in the flagship Yamato, and he was assembling the reports of the inconclusive battle that had just ended. Yamamoto was at the Big Truk naval base, and General Huat was at Rabaul, and while Yamamoto understood the importance of Guadalcanal, the army was still labouring with the dream of conquering New Guinea. The significance of the unwelcome intrusion in the Solomons had not struck home on August 27th. The Rabaul Air Base launched attacks, but the 2 bombing raids failed to get through because of bad weather. A B-17 and 14 Army Air Force P-400S landed to augment the Cactus Air Force at Shortland. The Japanese relief troops were once more divided among destroyer transports, and now escorted by destroyer Divion 20, they again set out for Guadalcanal on August 28th. The Japanese ships were to be covered from the air by a bombing raid of 18 twin-engine Bettys escorted by 0 fighters just before dusk on August 28th. The coast watchers announced the Japanese convoy coming down the slot. The Japanese bomber force was not in evidence, and it never did appear that day again, held back by bad weather between Cavan and Guadalcanal. The American evening air patrol of 2 dive bombers discovered the Japanese flotilla and bombed, but did not score any hits. These scouts, however, did arouse Henderson Field, and before 6:11 dive bombers took off. When the Japanese commander of the destroyers came under that attack, he radioed Combined Fleet for help, and Admiral Yamamoto sent a force of bombers and fighters to protect the ships. But the American planes were much closer and got there first, and just before dark the dive bombers began to peel off. Leah 10 and Chrysaor dropped a 1,000-pound bomb directly amidships of the destroyer Asagiri. The bomb drove through the deck to the ship's magazine, and the Asagiri blew up Lieutenant Turner Caldwell of the Enterprise, put a bomb into the destroyer Shirakumo, and damaged her badly. The Americans lost 1 dive bomber to the destroyer's anti-aircraft fire. The other destroyers came to the assistance of the survivors of the Asagiri, but among those lost was Captain Yuzo Arita, the divisional commander, which left the force without its leader. The Amagiri and the Yugiri were both damaged, and the Amagiri was able to the Shirakumo back to Shortland, and the Yugiri made it under her own power. But once again the reinforcements had been turned back from Rabaul. The Japanese saw that unless they could keep Henderson Field neutralized, it would be virtually impossible for them to land reinforcements. As of August 25th, RAB's 11th Air Fleet was seriously short of planes following the almost constant activity of the previous week and the heavy losses occasioned by the 500-mile distance from Guadalcanal, which damaged planes could hardly negotiate. The Japanese force was down to 29 bombers, and 19 more were in the pipeline. But the reaction in Tokyo had not been as swift as anticipated, and the shortage persisted. Still, Admiral Yamamoto was determined that the reinforcements would be landed, and on August 29th the 11th Air Fleet sent 2 bombing attacks. The first was staged at 4 o'clock in the morning by float plane from New Georgia, and the 3 bombers did no serious damage. The second appeared at the usual hour just before noon, which represented the 5-hour flight between a dawn takeoff at Rabaul and arrival at Guadalcanal. 22 twin-engine Bettys came in, escorted by 22 Zos. The Marines again had plenty of warning from the coast watchers. The Americans had 10 F-4Fs and 14 P-400S in the air. But when the Japanese arrived at high altitude as usual, the P-400S were useless. They could not climb to reach the bombers. It took the F-4Fs a little time to get altitude, and by then the Japanese had already bombed the airfield, damaging 2 more F-4Fs, and tearing more holes in the runway. The fighters took after them and claimed to have shot down 4 bombers and 4 Zeros. The figure was probably much lower, but at least one Betty the pilot, apparently killed at the controls, went into the ground at a speed of 600 miles per hour to erupt in a blaze of flame. In its way, the raid was a success. At the end of it, General Vandergrift counted his aerial resources. Only 8 F-4Fs were operational, and the P-400S might as well not have been there. They were of no use at all in protecting the airfield. Admiral Tanaka at Shortland had learned from the experience of August 28th that it was dangerous to move the destroyers carrying reinforcements into the waters of Guadalcanal in the daylight hours. So on August 29th he delayed the sailing of the 6 destroyers that would make the run with 1,000 reinforcements. The force was spotted by a P-by patrol plane in mid-voyage, but there was nothing for General Vandergrift to do but wait until the Japanese ape approached the island that day. The Marines on the ground were busier than usual. For the past few days they had been engaged in small firefights with the Japanese in the Matano area, and every day they waited for something to happen with General Vandergrift's order to assume a defensive stance the Marines had drawn up in a perimeter 7 m wide and 4 mil deep around Henderson Field from Lunga Point on the Channel, since the island of Guadalcanal is 90 miles long and 30 miles wide. This disposition gave the Japanese almost unlimited area in which to land and move troops just before noon. The transport William Ward Burroughs arrived off Lunga Point, showing that Admiral Gawley had reacted to General Vandergrift's pleas as quickly as he could. This meant Marine Air Group 23 would have its own mechanics and spare parts after a week and a half of operations. The planes needed serious attention. The dust and mud of the airstrip, plus the damages sustained in combat, affected every plane after the Japanese air raid that day. The unloading continued until late afternoon, when Aort of the new Japanese destroyer force en route from the Shortlands caused General Vandergrift to have the transport moved over to the protected harbour on the Tulagi side of the Sound, where there was less likelihood of an attack. The Burroughs moved and promptly ran around at Tagi. And on August 29th, when the 7 Japanese destroyers were warned that American ships, a cruiser, 2 transports and 2 destroyers, were off Guadalcanal, Admiral Tanaka opted to go ahead anyway. After some hesitation, Admiral Mawa, the commander of the 8th Fleet, agreed that evening when the destroyers were sighted again, General Vandergrift feared they would not only land troops but sink the stranded Burroughs. The pilots at Henderson Field were warned that they must be prepared to make a late-night attack, and all operational dive bombers were launched just after midnight as the 7 Japanese destroyers came into Tivu Point to land troops. The American planes did not find the Japanese ships, but they served a useful purpose just the same. Admiral Tanaka had ordered the destroyer commander to land the troops and then shell the American ships in the Sound. But when the commander saw the American bombers, he landed the 1,000 troops quickly, then hauled out at high speed and hurried out of the danger zone back to the Shortlands. Admiral Tanaka was so enraged by this timidity that he relieved the destroyer divisional commander on the spot. However, belatedly, the Japanese air and manpower pipelines in the South Pacific were beginning to flow. This had occurred when General Huake had finally been convinced that there were many more Americans on Guadalcanal than anyone had earlier believed, and then he had convinced Tokyo the quickest way to bring troops was to deliver small detachments via destroyer transport, particularly as long as the Americans maintained their air control of Henderson Field. Night delivery of troops seemed to be the solution. Admiral Yamamoto felt sure that if the Japanese interdicted supplies to the Americans and resupplied their own men, the American effort would fail as they ran out of ships. So the Tokyo Express, as the Americans called these nightly foray, or the Rat Patrol, as the Japanese called them, became a major factor in Japanese naval policy in the South Pacific. It was not that Admiral Yamamoto did not have the naval power at hand to risk a battle. It was his decision that a battle was not necessary. A week earlier, General Hiyake had reluctantly decided that Major General Seiken Kawaguchi Brigade, which had been intended for Papua New Guinea, must be diverted to stop the nuisance on Guadalcanal. When General Kawaguchi learned of the Rat Patrol system, he was appalled he had been very successful in moving troops around the Dutch East Indies by landing barges, and insisted that this method be employed. Admiral Tanaka disagreed, but the barges began collecting on Santa Isabel Island. In the meantime, however, even Kawaguchi recognized that the destroyer run was essential. With the shortage of fighters and pilots in the 11th Air Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto decided he would have to employ the pilots of the carriers Shakaku and Zuikaku to fly cover for the bombers, and their first mission came on August 30th. As usual, the coast watchers had the word, and passed it along before the men at Henderson heard any planes. All 19 flyable fighters were put into the air, and that included 7 of the P-400S. Earlier, 4 P-400S had taken to the air, on the theory that their real value might be to circle above the William Ward Burroughs, perhaps to prevent torpedo and low-level bombing attacks. When the fighters got up that day, the 7 Army planes suddenly peeled off and went screaming down on Toy the pilots in the F-4Fs who were climbing for altitude, then saw the reason the grounded Burroughs was indeed under Japanese attack. by stubweed Zeros from the carrier. The Americans called them ramps. The P-400S and F-4Fs came out of the sun and caught the Japanese by surprise in the first pass. They shot down 8 Japanese fighters. Then the Japanese recovered, and the air was filled with dogfights. The sky was cloudy. A front that rose to 40,000 feet was standing between Guadalcanal and Florida Island, and American and Japanese planes ducked in and out of the clouds, attacking as they went around and around. The whole engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, and when it was over, the Americans had lost 4 of the P-400S, although 2 pilots came back, and none of the F-4Fs, although 3 were put out of action pending repair.